do this to me. Don't do this to me in front of the camera. Don't do this to me, okay? Just do it how we practiced.
A YouTuber sat in front of the camera, casually speaking to his audience, thanking them for supporting his videos, and hinting that he was planning something big for the channel. At the time, the upload barely stood out among the hundreds of anime reviews and low-budget skits he had already posted online. But after what happened days later, people returned to his videos over and over again, trying to figure out whether there had been warning signs hidden in plain sight. Because by the end of that same week, 3 people inside a normal family home in rural Texas would no longer be with us, and investigators would later discover that he was barely even getting started. Long before he became known online as Mr. Anime, Trey Sesler lived a relatively ordinary life in the small town of Waller. He was born in 1989 to Rhonda and Lawton. His father worked as a respected elementary school teacher, while his mother worked for a local newspaper. People who knew the family described them as quiet and private. The Ceslers were not known for constant arguments, police visits, or obvious instability. To outsiders, they looked like a fairly normal family living in a small Texas community. Trey also had an older brother named Mark. As a teenager, Trey developed interests that many people online would have considered fairly typical for the late 2000s internet era. Things like anime, movies, and the ever-growing world of internet culture. He graduated from Waller High School in 2007 and later attended community college for a short period, though he never completed his studies. Teachers described him as intelligent, but also argumentative and difficult at times. Still, nobody publicly described him as a person to be scared of or concerned about in those years. In 2006, Trey created a YouTube channel called Mr. Anime. At first, the channel mostly featured anime reviews, comedy sketches, fake action scenes, and even some videos filmed with friends. Some clips showed Trey and his brother making low-budget comedic videos involving fake weapons and exaggerated action scenes. It felt very much like early YouTube. Messy and amateur, but at least it felt genuine. And surprisingly, the channel slowly began building an audience. Within certain anime communities online, Trey became relatively well known. Some viewers later claimed he had even inspired other anime reviewers, who eventually became much larger creators themselves. For years, the channel mostly stayed within that niche. But around 2010 and 2011, viewers started noticing changes. The tone of the uploads became stranger, darker, more uncomfortable, and eventually people began wondering whether they were watching someone slowly unravel in real time. As the Mr. Anime channel grew, Trey appeared increasingly invested in the identity he had built online. YouTube was no longer just a hobby. It had become one of the few places where he appeared confident and comfortable. Offline though, things seemed much less stable. Trey struggled to maintain jobs for any length of time. Over the years, he worked temporary positions including delivering pizza, gas station work, campground jobs, grocery stores, and other short-term employment. Family members later suggested he had ongoing mental health struggles for years. Investigators would also later discover prescription medications linked to anxiety and psychiatric treatment inside the home. But online, Trey could still present himself as entertaining, as confident, and as actually being quite funny. But that was not to last. Over time, viewers noticed the videos changing. The fake weapons seen in earlier comedy videos were gradually replaced with real firearms. Instead of simply discussing anime, Trey began showing rifles, ammunition, and tactical equipment directly to the camera. Some uploads became noticeably erratic. In one video, he appeared intoxicated while speaking to viewers. In others, he seemed emotionally detached or exhausted. Fans who had watched him for years later said he no longer seemed like the same person. Around this same period, Trey also became deeply fascinated with mass shootings and serial killers. That obsession would later become one of the most important discoveries in the entire investigation. Police eventually found evidence showing Trey had spent years researching infamous killers, especially the Columbine High School massacre, and this was not casual interest. Investigators discovered that Trey had memorized timelines, attack details, casualty counts, weapons that were used, and tactical decisions connected to multiple mass killings. He even created written ratings, analyzing how effective different murderers had actually been. According to investigators, he studied previous attacks almost like a student reviewing case studies, trying to understand what worked, what failed, and how someone could inflict even greater damage. At the same time, his real-world behavior was becoming increasingly disturbing. Trey later admitted that violent thoughts rarely left his mind for more than a few days at a time. He claimed he had fantasies involving shootings for years. At one point, he even admitted to considering becoming a serial killer before deciding the risk of capture would be too stressful. What makes this especially disturbing is how long this escalation appears to have lasted, without anyone fully understanding where it was actually heading. Because by the time police finally entered the Sesler home in March 2012, investigators would conclude that Trey had already spent years mentally preparing himself for violence. And according to his own confessions, those preparations had already become very real long before he did what he did. By 2011, Trey Sesler was spending long periods isolated inside a property his mother had inherited in nearby Hempstead. According to Trey himself, that isolation became dangerous. He later told investigators that being alone for extended periods allowed his mind to run away with violent fantasies. Investigators realized this was not simply fascination. It had become an all-consuming fixation instead. And over time, that fixation began bleeding into real-world behavior. Trey later admitted to killing animals during late-night drives around rural Texas. According to his confessions, he targeted cows and horses in isolated fields, using rifles from inside his car. He also admitted to firing at abandoned buildings, businesses, and schools after dark. Investigators would later connect him to fires and other acts of destruction throughout the area. What makes these admissions especially important is that investigators viewed them as escalation behavior, a progression, not isolated incidents. Police later described Trey as fitting a classic pattern seen in some violent offenders, starting with smaller acts, things like property destruction, secretive criminal behavior, then gradually building towards something larger. Meanwhile, Trey himself appeared increasingly paranoid and unstable. He admitted to constantly carrying loaded weapons around his family home. He placed alarms and improvised security measures around the Hempstead property because he feared someone might come after him. At one point, he even rigged a shotgun trap inside the house, before later dismantling it because he was worried his parents might accidentally trigger it. The contradictions in Trey's behavior became impossible to ignore. He repeatedly claimed he loved his family deeply, but at the same time he was fantasizing about violence almost constantly, and people close to him had started noticing something was wrong. According to later interviews, Trey's father and brother had both privately expressed fears that he might eventually harm the family. Even Trey himself admitted he knew he had serious problems. Just days before the events of this video, he sent a text message to his mother, asking her to urgently arrange him a psychiatric appointment. But whatever internal collapse had been building for years was now quickly accelerating, and by March 2012, Trey was no longer just imagining violence, he was actively preparing for it. During the night of March 19th, into the early hours of March 20th, everything finally collapsed. According to Trey's later confession, the murders were not planned far in advance in the traditional sense. He claimed the final decision was formed only hours before he carried it out, but investigators also knew he had spent years obsessing over violence, collecting weapons and planning mass casualty scenarios. So even if the exact timing was impulsive, the mindset behind it clearly was not. Sometime after midnight, Trey asked his mother Rhonda to come into the garage with him. Once there, he pulled the trigger multiple times at close range. The loud noises alerted his older brother Mark inside the house. Mark reportedly came out to investigate, confused about the noise he had just heard. Trey then armed himself with another weapon and confronted him. After being hurt, Mark managed to retreat into a bathroom and lock the door, but Trey continued firing through the door before forcing his way inside. Their father, Lawton, had meanwhile been awakened by all of the noise. As he attempted to understand what was happening inside the house, Trey pulled the trigger, while aiming at him as well. According to investigators, Trey later returned to each victim again to ensure that their time was definitely over, and after the deed was done, the situation inside the home became even more chaotic. Trey began destroying the property almost room by room. He smashed objects, shot household items, destroyed furniture, knocked over shelves, damaged appliances, and scattered belongings throughout the house. Investigators later described the scene as resembling a war zone. Messages were also written across the walls of the property. Some expressed confusion, others expressed guilt and remorse. One message said, "I love my mom, dad, and brother." Another message said, "Why did I do this?" And another said, "God forgive me because I cannot forgive myself." Those messages would later become some of the most haunting details in the case, because they suggested Trey understood almost immediately that he had permanently destroyed his own life along with his family's. But the violence inside the house still was not over. Investigators later confirmed Trey also then turned on the family pets. At one stage, after destroying large portions of the property, Trey reportedly lay down beside his mother's body in the garage and fell asleep. The murders had taken place over only a relatively short period of time, but by sunrise, an entire family had been erased, and according to police, Trey still intended to continue, because sitting outside the destroyed house was a black Ford Mustang loaded with weapons and ammunition, and investigators would soon conclude that the murders inside the Sesler home may have only been the beginning of a much larger attack. After ending his family, Trey began preparing for the next stage of the plan that investigators believe he had been building toward for years. Police later recovered firearms, including a rifle, along with large amounts of ammunition connected to the planned attack. And according to Trey's later confessions, his intended target was his former place of education, the same place he had graduated from only a few years earlier. Investigators later learned Trey had spent years studying previous similar attacks and imagining different attack scenarios. One alleged plan involved targeting a crowded pep rally. Another involved crashing a vehicle into the building before unleashing his weapons. During questioning, Trey reportedly admitted he wanted to inflict massive devastation and become one of the worst criminals of that type in history. But something changed after the ending of his family. According to Trey, reality finally began breaking through the fantasy. He later claimed that the situation suddenly became too real. For years, this darkness had existed mostly in research, imagination, internet videos, and obsessive planning. But now 3 real people were gone for good, and according to his own statements, that reality caused him to hesitate. Instead of continuing to the planned location, Trey eventually drove to a friend's house in Magnolia, Texas. Meanwhile, concern had already started to grow back in Waller. Relatives had become unable to contact the family and requested an immediate welfare check. When officers arrived at the house later that day, they entered the property and discovered the bodies. An arrest warrant was quickly issued for Trey. Police also immediately realized there could be a wider threat. Authorities feared he was heavily armed and possibly preparing further violence. Places of education throughout the district increased security, while investigators attempted to determine whether a larger attack was still possible. Later that evening, Trey was located and arrested without incident at a friend's house in Magnolia. Investigators from the FBI, Texas Rangers, and local law enforcement quickly began searching multiple locations that were connected to him. Inside those searches, they discovered weapons, ammunition, writings, computers, and evidence of years of violent fantasies and planning. And perhaps most disturbingly of all, investigators became increasingly convinced that a much larger attack may only have been hours away from happening. After his arrest, Trey confessed to everything during multiple interviews with investigators. At times he cried while describing what he had done, but investigators also noticed how casually he could discuss mass casualty events and other terrible things after years of studying them obsessively. During one interview, Trey began reciting detailed information about Columbine from memory with disturbing accuracy before investigators eventually stopped him. Police also uncovered years of escalating behavior hidden behind the Mr. Anime persona: fires, shooting at buildings, insane fantasies, and detailed plans for attacks. Investigators concluded that the murders had not emerged from nowhere. The warning signs had existed for years. Of course, online the reaction was immediate. Within the anime YouTube community, many viewers initially refused to believe the story was real. Some believed Trey had been framed. Others convinced themselves he was protecting somebody else. But as details continued emerging, denial became impossible. Multiple creators uploaded videos discussing the case, while viewers returned to Trey's old uploads searching for missed warning signs. And in hindsight, many people believed they could now see the deterioration happening in real time. What makes this case especially disturbing is how ordinary parts of Trey's life initially appeared. He had friends, creative hobbies, a supportive family, an online audience, plans for the future. But over years of isolation, obsession, substance misuse, untamed fantasy, and untreated instability, something inside him gradually collapsed. And by the time reality finally broke through that fantasy world, 3 people were already gone. Forever. Trey Sesler was eventually sentenced to life in prison without parole. The court concluded he remained a danger to both himself and others. As of today, he remains incarcerated in Texas. This case is probably a sign for all of us to get away from screens and out into nature. Thank you so much for watching. I'm uploading daily true crime and dark content here on this channel, so make sure that you're subscribed, hit like on the video, and also drop a comment so you get shown more of my stuff. Please do be careful out there, and I'll see you tomorrow.